Long, long ago, on the eastern side of the mountains of Data, overlooking the great Hiring Gap, the kingdom of Fakakta was ruled by King Verklempt. It wasn't much of a kingdom and he wasn't much of a king, but it had the best army in all the kingdoms that peppered the mountain range, mining the mountains of Data. In fact, Fakakta sat on a rich vein of input that was the envy of all of Data's domains. But under the rule of King Verklempt, the mining operation was slow and error-prone. His neighbors implored him, "Please, let us mine that input for you and we'll deliver riches beyond compare." Unfortunately, when he wasn't reviewing his fine army, King Verklempt indulged quite actively in his favorite hobby, shaving the yaks that roam free and plentiful in that part of the mountains. He didn't keep the hair. For him, the act was something to get lost in. His yak shaving was never meant to be, nor was it productive. And between his powerful army and his constant yak shaving, none of the neighboring kingdoms could get King Verklempt to process all that Fakakta input he was just sitting on. In the realms of Data, one trading guild stood out among all its competitors as the most dishonest, scheming, and untrustworthy of them all. They were called the Gonifs, and it was one of their traders who saw an opportunity to get his hands on all that input. So Pisher the Gonif wrangled and wheedled, finagled until he got an invitation to sit in the stands near King Verklempt as he reviewed his army. The soldiers marched past, each with their leathers and mail clean and buffed, each with their halberd and sword polished to a gleaming shine. They looked healthy and well-fed. As the last soldier passed, Pisher the Gonif stood and clapped with all his might. He yelled, "Hurrah! Hurrah!" He bowed to the departing soldiers, then turned and bowed to the king. "Your Highness," he called from the stands, "would you allow a simple merchant to ask a simple question?" The king nodded. "Your Highness, this is obviously the finest army I have ever seen, the finest in all the lands, but I wonder..." The king raised an eyebrow. "Is it the finest army it could be? Your Majesty, I ask you, how many of your soldiers are above average?"
Above average?" the king asked with surprise. Why, they're all above average. They are the finest army in all the lands."
"Yes, your Highness, a fine army, the finest indeed, but have you ever measured it to be sure?"
The king seemed insulted.
Of course I have," he said.
But instead of ordering Pisher executed for his insolence, the king stood abruptly and walked out of the stands, followed by his retinue. And Pisher the Gonif smiled, for he knew he had planted a seed of doubt. The following day, the king's messenger came to the inn where Pisher was staying and escorted him to the castle for a private audience with the king.
"Pisher," the king asked, "if we were to measure my soldiers to indeed ensure they were all above average, how would we go about doing so?"
Pisher laid out his plan. They would run each soldier through a battery of tests for strength, speed, and endurance. They would add up all the scores for all the soldiers, then divide them by the number of soldiers to get the average score. Any soldier whose score was not above average would be fired from the army and sent home, leaving only the soldiers who were above average. The king thought it over, and the next week was spent testing every soldier in his army. They ran across fields and jumped over fences. They lifted bales of hay and even wrestled bears. And Pisher made a tidy side profit by selling the king precisely weighted lifting bales and specially trained wrestling bears. There were a number of soldiers who actually performed particularly poorly, dragging down the average and helping to prove Pisher's point. When it was all said and done, the king fired 3,300 of his 10,000 soldiers and sent them home. The king reviewed his remaining soldiers with satisfaction the next day.
"They are not as many," the king said to Pisher, who now sat next to him in the stands, "but they are the best in all the lands, for they are all above average."
"Ah, but are they, sire?" Pisher asked wistfully. "I am just afraid those low performers pulled the average down too much and allowed some average soldiers to slip through. We should test again to be absolutely sure."
So Pisher sold the king trained wolves for the soldiers to outrun, and 10 stone calves for the soldiers to lift. And out of the 6,700 soldiers the king had left, over 2,000 were not above average. And after the last soldier of that group was fired and sent home, Pisher said to the king,
"It was worse than I thought. That first group of poor performers pulled the average down so much, we almost missed all these others. But with so many in this round."
And so it went. Each time when the test caused soldiers who were not above average to be fired and sent home, Pisher presented this as proof that they were pulling down the average. The execution of the test was not complete until no soldiers had to be dismissed, and they were all above average. And for each round, Pisher sold the king specialized equipment to ensure the tests were fair. After 6 more rounds of testing, King Verklempt doubted Pisher's wisdom.
Pisher, he said, I have benefited from your counsel, but I have just 612 soldiers left. I am willing to say that these are the 612 best, most above average soldiers in my army. I will begin rebuilding, using these great men as the cornerstone of my new army.
"Ah, but can you, sire?"
What do you mean?
"As above average as these 612 soldiers may be, are they any match for all the soldiers you dismissed?"
Pisher pulled a horn from his belt and blew it. On cue, soldiers streamed into the parade grounds from all directions, but instead of being loyal to King Verklempt, Pisher had hired them with all the money he made selling the equipment to test them, and because those 612 soldiers were above average, when confronted with 15-to-1 odds, they were smart enough to surrender immediately. In the Guild of Gonifs, they memorialized the greatest exploits by their greatest members, and because they are all considered to be as wily as serpents, they write them down in code using a language they call Python. Here is the code for Pisher's exploit. Just to have some data to work with, we create a set of 10,000 values with random strengths. When we run the remove below average function on them, if it has to remove any before it completes, it runs itself again. It is only ever complete when an iteration of it returns a result that meets the condition of not having to remove a soldier. Thus Pisher the Gonif became the king of Fakakta. And the moral of the story, besides never trusting a Gonif, never get so caught up in the process of optimization that you let it harm what you sought to optimize.